welcome to the second annual Your Healthy Mind Summit. I'm your host, Dr. Kirsten DeWitt, licensed naturopathic doctor and acupuncturist. And for this masterclass, I have with me Dr. Nikita Patel to discuss transforming childhood trauma, a root cause of many chronic physical diseases. Dr. Nikita is a leading mind-body heart healer, well-being mentor, and naturopathic doctor. She utilizes her own personal experience as well as research and training from the Heart-Centered Wellness Institute, HeartMath Institute, American Institute of Mindbody Medicine, Shamanic Healing Institute, and the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology. So she has you covered, okay? And I'm so excited for her to discuss this very important topic because I think a lot of us have heard this connection, and maybe some of us understand it, but having the tools and just understanding of how to help transform that the childhood trauma that so many people experience. So thank you so much, Dr. Nikita, for being here and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction. The mouthful of institutions.
Yes.
To read off.
Well, you've done so much of your own healing and training, like many of us have, once we begin to learn more about the mind-body connection, right? It's hard not to go down a rabbit hole and to want to just continue learning. So thank you for doing that work and for sharing with us what you've learned and continuing to help people transform their health. So thank you.
You're most welcome, and thank you too for this wonderful introduction. All right, so I'm going to share my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Hit play. So as Dr. Kirsten mentioned, we're going to be talking about transforming childhood trauma and really understanding in what way is it connected to your chronic physical disease. Of course, there's a lot of data in trauma and mental illness, but it's not as well recognized or common to associate trauma with chronic physical diseases, let alone getting proper treatment for it. So my goal for today is to bring awareness to the impact of childhood trauma on physical health in adulthood so that you can recognize this in you and get proper care to feeling good. So we'll start with trauma. It gets thrown around and there are a lot of different meanings behind trauma. So what is trauma? By an Oxford Dictionary definition, it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, like a death of a child. Medical definition of trauma is physical injury. A trauma in psychiatry, when it's diagnosed something as trauma, a mental trauma, it's due to an actual or threatened death or serious injury or sexual violence. American Psychology Association goes a little further in explaining trauma, and they say it's more of an emotional response. So now it's becoming a personal experience, but still to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. So this is very obvious. We know this as trauma. We can see it, right? Another person can see it. However, what trauma really is that I'm referring to, and now that we're seeing more and more of when it comes to chronic disease, it's more of a subjective experience of an event or a series of events. And the event is not, it doesn't need to be labeled. It's not what's important in what defines a trauma. It's more of a person's capacity to cope. So any event that causes an overwhelming feeling and overwhelms one's capacity to cope. It's a subjective experience, and it is not useful to only define by an objective point of view. So no one can say, oh yeah, your mom slapped you when you were 3 years old just once. I don't think that's physical abuse. And that therefore it does not constitute as a trauma. It's not as bad as being beaten almost to death. That's what we want to come out of. We want to come out of comparing, like, okay, it needs to look like a terrible event for it to be traumatic. It doesn't. It's really a personal experience. And the inner experience can be the same as someone who's gone through an event that appears to be terrible by another person versus not appeared as terrible. They have equal amount of impact on our nervous system, on our physiology, and how it relates to the formation of physical disease. Does that feel clear? Okay. So what does it look like, right? I showed you what it can be, sort of an overview of the definition. What does it look like? A classic one is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? There is a word trauma in it. And high stress, treatment-resistant mental illnesses like depression and anxiety, delayed onset signs and symptoms of diseases, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, treatment-resistant physical diseases. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's very common when someone has PTSD. There are some signs of PTSD like flashbacks, recurrent or intrusive memories of the traumatic event, or recurrent dreams related to the traumatic event, avoidance behavior to anything that resembles the traumatic event. There is, when it's really severe, it impairs the person who's experiencing PTSD, their ability to perform well at a job or have healthy relationships or connect in a healthy way socially. And when we think of PTSD, the classic example is veterans, because of the war trauma. You know, they went through death, killing, survival, a very high stress situation. Again, what makes a negative life event traumatizing isn't the life-threatening nature of the event, but rather the degree of powerlessness it engenders and one's history of prior trauma. So even people who have PTSD due to trauma in adulthood, they have prior history of trauma that didn't translate to PTSD until it was triggered later on by another trauma or a re-traumatization event. Another way trauma can show up, or traumatized nervous system, a childhood trauma, is brain fog. So many people that come to us in our naturopathic medicine, holistic alternative medicine, struggle with brain fog. There's constant worry, chronic insomnia, they are easily irritable, and there is low tolerance to disagreeable things or disagreeable conversations. We talked about PTSD, high stress, and another way trauma shows up is in mental illness that is treatment resistant. So that means any doctor, a holistic doctor or an allopathic doctor, talk therapy, they're given all these therapies, but it works for a little bit and then it doesn't. So what ends up happening is their medication list goes up, their dosing goes up, and there's still talk therapy, which helps. It helps a little bit, but it doesn't really create a significant difference in their mental health. And many people often get misdiagnosed. In what I mean to say is they'll go to their psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist, and they won't have their trauma uncovered, and it'll continue to be misdiagnosed as treatment resistant depression or anxiety, rather than, okay, your nervous system is traumatized, you're having a traumatized experience, and let's work on treatments that help process this trauma in your body, versus how can we change your depressive behaviors or change the behaviors around anxiety so that you're managing your depression and anxiety. Okay, I hope that makes sense. You can ask me questions as well during our live Q&A. So another way a trauma shows up in a person's life is later on in life. It can be 40 years later, or it can be 2 years later, but it's later on in life when physical symptoms come up, even mental symptoms come up. And usually most healthcare workers will not really see the trauma connection. There will be a connection of, okay, there is some change, major change in life that happened 2 years ago or 10 years ago. Usually the closer it is to the onset or diagnosis of an illness, the easier the traumatic event or the change in life is seen. But when it's a long time ago, it doesn't usually come up. And really mostly because the person with the illness, the patient, her or himself, doesn't know to bring it up either. They don't know, like, okay, this is a possibility. So it can show up as any health issue, from indigestion, diabetes, acne, chronic fatigue, Lyme's, SIBO, autoimmune disease, and illnesses, all the way up to terminal illness like cancer. And it's important to know that the chronic illnesses do not happen overnight. They get diagnosed overnight, but they do not happen overnight. It usually takes many years of physiological changes for it to become a pathology, for it to change the tissue and create this disease in the body. And the physiology is changed because of the traumatized nervous system that influences the physiology. So good news is that it can be prevented and successfully treated by addressing the traumatized nervous system. And I'll talk a little bit more about the childhood trauma, and I won't have time to discuss the traumatized nervous system aspect, maybe another day, or you can ask me questions about it. But just wanted to introduce that right now. And treatment-resistant chronic illnesses. For someone who has trauma, they usually show up to our offices as multiple food sensitivities, allergies, lots of allergies, intolerance to pharmaceutical medications, intolerance even to natural medicines, worsening of symptoms even on a healthy diet, like the healthiest diet, lifestyle, amazing herbs, and increasing number of supplements, taking all the nutrients, multivitamins. Even with all of this, there is worsening of symptoms. Maybe there is some improvement, but usually relapses. It works for a little bit, and then there is a relapse. And overall, nothing seems to work. That's usually the thought that comes in the mind. Nothing seems to work, and the desperation seems to be growing stronger. And I know this really well because I've seen this in my practice. And there's a lot of research in the connection between the two, but also because I have gone through it myself. So that's how trauma shows up. It doesn't always have to be PTSD, nor does it always have to be an objective traumatic event that meets a certain definition. It really is more than that, deeper than that. Again, so childhood trauma is basically as a child, as a developing child, developing person, when our nervous system is developing, we go through an event, and what happens, the way we respond is we feel overwhelmed to cope. And when we feel overwhelmed to cope, we look for people around us to help us. But when there is a lack of that, what ends up happening is there is suppression and repression of emotions. So suppression is consciously repressing it, like I can't deal with it right now, I just need to put it aside. And repression is unconscious, burying the emotions that feels really overwhelming, and we don't even know that we're doing it. And again, the expression of emotions and the talking about the traumatic experience is often discouraged by the guardians or other adults and even the whole of community. And as a result, it becomes this unprocessed trauma that later on shows up in the physical body. The emotions, they stay buried in the subconscious for years and years and years, and we forget about it over time. And then we have this self-protective mental mechanism, this belief system that act as like protectors of our emotions that we could never express, process. Now we gotta suppress it now, and we need a protective mechanism to do it. And what that looks like, I want to give an example, is say there is a 5-year-old girl, and she is walking, and she stumbles on a tiny rock and falls down, gets hurt, and her guardian, a parent or someone who's watching her, tells her, you're dumb, you can't even see what you're doing. Doesn't comfort her, or no one's there for her to make her feel better from the pain she gets from tripping over this rock. So now she has these emotions of pain. She doesn't know what to do. It feels overwhelming to this little child. And naturally, what happens to survive, to make it through, is these self-protective mechanisms come up. Now, the child may believe that, okay, I need to be extra, extra, extra careful and always look down when I'm walking on grass, because that's where the rock was hiding, and make sure that I don't trip over again ever, because the pain she felt was it was overwhelming. To her, it was very traumatic. So as she grows up into adult, she forgets about this experience, but the belief is there. That's a self-protective belief. Okay, to prevent myself from being hurt again like this, I need to look down every time I'm walking on the grass and make sure that I'm looking out for all the rocks that could be there waiting to trip me over. So then that keeps on repeating and repeating in adulthood, and that's a stress response in the body. That's the trauma response in the body. So was that clear? Okay. So this I call it self-protective mechanism, because it's not something that we do because we are dumb or stupid or crazy. It's actually a very smart thing to do to cope what's overwhelming and protect our wound, the pain that we couldn't process, and then also make sure that we're preventing more from happening. And this self-protective mechanism then becomes a mental, emotional, and spiritual wound that eventually finds its way to the outer body, to the physical body, to matter as a physical illness. And I've seen this over and over in my practice, their connection of their illness to childhood experiences growing up.
And I just wanted, because you were asking if it was clear, right, to add, because you said, the child from now on, right, into adulthood, they look down to help protect themselves, both physically from the physical pain, but also from that emotional pain of not wanting to look dumb, right? If the guardian, if that's what they told them, they look dumb for tripping, for not being aware, right? So that's like the other aspect of that protective, right?
Yeah, that then turns into, okay, what can I do to prove myself that I'm smart? And that can be, okay, I'm gonna make sure that I get straight A's no matter what. I will go to the best university no matter what, study overnight, drink coffee, eat whatever. My focus is, how can I prove to this belief that I'm dumb, that I'm not dumb, I'm smart. Yeah. So it impacts actions, behaviors, and behaviors lead to poor lifestyle habits that lead to formation of physical illnesses again in the body. Yeah, thank you for also bringing that up. So I really want to emphasize this over and over and over. A childhood trauma, it can be considered life-threatening by definition, or not. It's more about how a person experiences this event. And it doesn't have anything to do with a person's mental strength, because this comes up a lot, like, oh, you're not mentally strong, that's why this That's why you're not able to process this trauma. That's why you got sick. Or people who have PTSD are not mentally strong. That's not true. That's not true at all. It really has more to do with prior history of trauma and also family history, because there is intergenerational trauma. So not everyone comes with a blank slate of basically, where there is first trauma and then second trauma and the third trauma. There are people who have traumatized nervous system, traumatic behaviors, traumatic DNA that's inherited from their ancestors through multiple generations. And it's really also a biological inheritance as well, because we see the genetics, the genetic diseases, also non-genetic diseases, like that we now see that there is some genetic contribution, but it doesn't always appear that way, like diabetes, cholesterol, heart disease, the major ones. There is intergenerational trauma. So we want to address that as well. Sometimes it's not the first childhood traumatic experience, but it's more of what was inherited, and then there is a re-traumatization in the nervous system. Okay. So a study with the childhood trauma in medicine, we didn't really connect the dots in medicine until mid-90s. And this was the result of this ACE study done by CDC Kaiser Permanente together. And they wanted to see, does childhood abuse, neglect, and household challenges have any relationship to later life health and well-being, right? This is outside of mental illnesses. This is actually connection to physical illnesses. That's what they wanted to see. So what they did was they sent out this survey to their patients. They had these doctors in their network, and they asked the doctors to send out a survey to their patients who've had physical exam done. And 70% of the people, so it was around 13,000 people that received the survey by mail. And 70% of them completed the survey and sent it back. And this survey was a confidential survey regarding their childhood experiences and current health status. And this is on the side, the tiny font. That's actually the survey that was sent over. There are 10 questions, and basically they needed to fill out and send it back. So what was found was that there was a significant relationship between the number of ACEs. So there are 10 questions, and each yes is a score, and it can add up to 10, or it can be 1, or it can be 0. And the study found that more than 50% of the people who had at least 1 or more of ACE score had some form of mental illness, physical illness, and mental illness. And there was a direct relationship, a graded relationship between the higher the ACE score, the severe and more complex and more different types of illnesses a person has. So in this study, what was looked at that time was there was a significant relationship between childhood trauma, adverse childhood events, childhood trauma, depression, drug use, addictions, suicide attempt, and diseases like obesity. And that's a huge one. Obesity, heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, bone fractures. I mean, like people having bone fractures from accidents, from falling down, and liver disease. Like, these are physical health issues that are directly related to childhood trauma. And the questionnaire, it can be Googled, a study questionnaire. If you want, you can send me an email and I'll send you the questionnaire. I really do recommend that you sit with a healthcare professional to fill this out because it can be activating, sometimes re-traumatizing, to think about something in the past and still not have the proper support to process the trauma. But you can take a look at it. And if you want to go over it, you can, of course, if you're watching this and you're working with me already, let me know and we'll go over it together. But if not, talk to your healthcare practitioner and you can also work with me and we'll go over it together too. Okay, so a little bit about the nervous system. Before this ACE study in science, it was recognized that trauma alters brain development, function, and structure. That was the extent to it. It impacts the behaviors and alters brain development and function. But now we know that it alters the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight, rest, digest aspect of our system, the physiology, hormones, immune system, stress responses, and gene function, epigenetics. So childhood trauma impacts a lot of biological processes in our body aside from just the brain. And it doesn't always show up as a mental illness. It can also show up as a physical illness. And it passes down. If it's not treated in one generation, then it passes down to the next generation until next and next, until someone decides to get proper or receives the proper treatment to stop that passing down of the traumatized nervous system and the physiology and the genetics. So now we have a lot more research since the first ACE study, and there is a direct relationship between ACEs, the childhood traumatic experiences, and they're not even looking at trauma from an overwhelming capacity to cope, the subjective experience. They're really mostly looking at childhood traumas of traumatic events that are defined as traumatic, life-threatening events. And what they're seeing is that there's an increased risk for chronic illnesses and poor health. And you can go to chronicillnesstraumastudies.com to get more information on this as well. But really, all these chronic illnesses, thyroid issues, sleep disorders, autoimmune illness, irritable bowel disease, obesity. Obesity is a huge one. You know, there's so many people wanting to lose weight, and there's so many people who can't, and there's always this new thing in the market to help you lose weight. But really, what most people with obesity need is a trauma-informed therapy. Hypertension is on this list, chronic fatigue, heart disease, diabetes. Yeah. There's a lot. that's associated to childhood trauma aside from mental illness. So that was the scientific overview of trauma, medical overview. I wanted to add in a spiritual perspective because it doesn't always show up physically right away, but spiritually it's there, and it can be detected early on when we're really in tune. But when it's not detected, there are signs that can be seen by another person, or you can see that in yourself. There's a sense of stuckness, this trapped energy, a disconnection to nature outside, and the nature that's within us, our natural body system, our natural biology. There's a disconnection to this flow of life, and there's a lack of trust in life and the unknown. Like, can't trust the unknown, and there's usually fear of life and the unknown. So that's how it shows up early on. Usually things show up first spiritually, energetically, it's more spiritual energy, and then it's mental, emotional, and eventually physical. So the way we can prevent it is we can become aware of the subtle signs, which are usually, from a spiritual perspective, changes in energy, become more in tune with what's happening inside of our body, and not wait until the body breaks down into physical illness to treat the trauma. Okay. So I wanted to add in a little bit of my story. And I have a picture from 2019. I really tried to get the best picture because I do, it was all over. It wasn't always like bad times. What I really want to show is that it was the end of 2019 when my physical health gave out. But before then, I was fine. I looked fine. And I wanted to put up a picture of me when I looked fine. And I don't know if you can see it, but I can see the facade that I had on of like just hanging in there, trying to go through life and pushing everything aside, burying everything deep within, and not even wanting to deal with it, in avoidance, complete denial of what was going on internally. And I didn't have the support outside of me to process it either. Even the multiple medical doctors that I went to were like, you know, one of them said, "Oh, you're stressing too much. Stop stressing. You'll be all right." And then he also made me feel ashamed for being sick. He's like, "Nothing's wrong with you." But I knew it wasn't true. So wanted to show you, in right before I even got sick. This is a picture of before I got sick. I was more focused on how I looked externally, like how my hair is placed and angling myself to take this picture. But I can see through now. I can see that there's a lot going on underneath. And I can usually see that in people too, because of my own personal experience and clinical experience. And then this is in 2022, just recently, a week ago. And I see a clear difference. Can you see the difference, Kirsten, in my energy? This is after years, a decade and more of healing work, internal healing work that I've done, in addition to changes in my lifestyle, taking herbs and supplements. That was a small part of my healing work. The major piece was healing my trauma through mind-body medicine. And I really do feel better and better and better and better as time goes on inside, and then it shows externally, and my body is healing externally as well. So I chose this picture in 2022 because there are words inscribed in the stone. This is in DC, this memorial in DC. And it says freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And when I read that, I feel like, whoa, I feel like rising, like Phoenix rising from ashes, because I had an experience like that where I felt like the ground from under my feet had crumbled and completely like taken off, and I fell and my physical body broke down and could no longer get well on its own. And I didn't have, the doctors that I went to didn't have any answers beyond you're stressing too much, or you're deficient in B12, or nothing's wrong with you. Beyond that, that was the extent of it. And thankfully, I found mind-body medicine to help me through my healing journey. So yeah, that's a little bit of my story. The mind-body medicine that I was talking about earlier. So shifting the traumatic physiology into well-being. That to me is what mind-body medicine is. And the general steps that I follow, I have it outlined here, and I wanted to share that with you so that you get an idea of what this healing process is like, because it is pretty new to many people. The first step is awareness of, okay, well, what's happening internally? What am I feeling? What am I thinking most of the time? And what am I feeling in my body in relationship to that? And in what ways is connected to my belief system, my thoughts, my emotions around my physical disease? Once we have that awareness, we can go a little deeper in embodying the suppressed and repressed emotions that has been there for so long, letting that flow in a very safe space, compassionate space, embracing the inner child, right? The child that first experienced this trauma, embracing that piece of you and loving the unloved parts. And once we have done that, the embodiment piece, we move on to releasing and replacing our limiting beliefs, our thoughts. What are we constantly thinking? And identifying, well, what are the limiting beliefs, the core limiting beliefs? And in what ways is this creating certain habits that actually hurt our body? So then we want to release that and replace it with healthy beliefs and healthy habits. And you do it. I guide you. You do it. And the last step is surrendering to the flow of life, to the inner healer, to res medicatrix naturae, right? The healing power of nature, outside and within. We're also nature. And our intuition, our inner knowing. Let that be the guiding force to keeping the body well. And oh, there is this screen that came up again and I can't see what I wrote, but really to be in the flow of well-being from inside out. Because the medicine we need, for the most part, we have it inside of us. And Many times we can rely on medicine from outside, like herbs and pharmaceutical medicine, to help us get to the medicine that's within us. But it's not meant to replace what can come from within us. Yeah. So that's the end of our talk. And really quickly, I wanted to give you some contact information. So I really want to connect with you. And I'm inviting you to text me at my number, 443-620-3397. Text me. I would like to set up a free Vibrant Goddess call with you as seen on Healthy Mind Summit with Dr. Kirsten. And we'll set up a call. I usually charge for anyone who sets up a Vibrant Goddess call with me, but for all the viewers, participants in this Healthy Mind Summit, it'll be free for you. It'll be my gift to you. And I will text you back more information. It may take me more, about 24 business hours or less to reply. So I appreciate your patience. And I also want to invite you, a second invitation to join a group program that I'll be guiding pretty soon, which is 21 weeks of self-care to well-being. And I'll email you more on it as well. Right now I'm developing it. So I just wanted to introduce that to you. It's my first introduction about this. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nikita. And I hope you all take her up on that free call. That is so generous of you. So thank you for offering that. And thank you again for just all of the information that you provided and some of these tools that have helped you and have helped those that you've worked with as well. And definitely remember to write down your questions so then we can answer those in the live Q&A part. So if you're in the Facebook group, then you can type them in there, or feel free to just email those questions to us and we'll be sure to ask them. All right. So thank you all so much. Again, thank you, Dr. Nikita, for your time and just for helping us better understand how childhood trauma can show up in the body and, ways that we can begin to do something about it. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We will see you in the next master class, everyone.